about biodiversity. Biodiversity can be looked at in a couple different lenses. First, we can look at genetic diversity. Genetic diversity is all the different genes within the gene pool of a species. We can look at species diversity. Species diversity is the number of different species that are available. And lastly, we can look at habitat diversity. Habitat diversity is basically all the different habitats that are available for all the different species to live in. The most common measure of biodiversity is looking at the number of different species. There are a few different indexes that ecologists use to look at the biodiversity of an area. A couple we can look at is the Shannon Index and the Simpson Index. There are a couple different indexes that we can look at to determine the biodiversity of an area. We have the Shannon Index, we have the Simpson Index, and essentially what these two equations are looking at is the number of species, or the species richness, and how many of each of the species are there, or species evenness. It takes into account the number of species in an area, as well as the amount of each species in an area, and takes a look at how diverse that area is. Within a population, there is variation in different traits. This variation is what drives evolution. Often it's what keeps the population going, because if there is variation and a disease comes through, organism is not going to be clones of each other, and there might be variation that allows some of those organisms to survive and then reproduce. So in the eyes of evolution, it's change over time of a population. So when we're looking at evolution, we don't necessarily look at the individual species, the individual. We're looking at the population as an overall. So with evolution, variation in the genetics diversity of that population is going to allow the population to have enough variation to hopefully continue surviving and reproducing. Evolutionary fitness is the ability to survive and reproduce. That is an important part. Not only do we want our individuals to survive, but we want the individuals to reproduce to keep that population going. The traits, or the variation within the traits that allow the organism to survive and reproduce, are generally advantageous because it allows them to reproduce and pass on their traits. This is where adaptations come from. So adaptations are those traits that allow the organism to survive and reproduce. Traits are defined by the organism's DNA. A slight change in DNA could mean a different trait. Slight changes in DNA can come from mutations, and just a reminder, mutations don't necessarily mean bad. Mutation just means change in DNA. It also could come from recombination of genes. Recombination is basically genes from different organisms that come together. Recombination occurs in sexual reproduction. Recombination comes from two different cells, sex cells, coming together, sperm and egg, fertilizing each other, and that is recombination, because you're taking traits or genes from one organism and traits or genes from another organism and combining them together, becoming a recombinant cell. Evolution can happen in a number of different ways. It can happen through natural selection. This is nature putting pressure on organisms, and organisms surviving and reproducing or not surviving and reproducing. So nature is essentially doing the selecting of the organisms that are able to survive and reproduce. There's artificial selection. Artificial selection is selection done by humans. We have been artificially selecting organisms for thousands of years. If you are a farmer and you are looking to sell your tomatoes, you're going to be picking the plants and the breeds that are hardy, produce a lot of fruit, produce big looking juicy tomato fruit, and you're not going to be choosing the plants that produce very little. So you're artificially selecting for the best looking producing tomato plants. If you think of broccoli, kale, mustard, Brussels sprouts, they're essentially all the same species. They're just different varieties. We have artificially selected the mustard plant to become different types of vegetables. So we've selected it one way to become broccoli. We've selected another way to become Kale, we've selected it to become Brussels sprouts. So we, as humans, artificially select all the time. And then there are a few random processes, such as gene flow. It is essentially genes moving from one population to another. Think of this as starting in the United States, emigrating to Asia, and you're bringing your genes from the United States to Asia. You're moving the genes from one area to another. We also have mutation, and again, remember, mutation is not always a bad thing. And then we have genetic drift. Genetic drift is basically some sort of thing that happens to the population. It could be a natural disaster. It could be a human-caused disaster that causes many organisms of a population to go away. So maybe a hurricane comes through and kills off a bunch of the population. A hurricane is not choosing necessarily for a certain type of trait. It's just coming through, and whichever organisms are surviving are going to be the ones that reproduce. So that population has gone through a bottleneck where the population was reduced, and whatever genes are left over are the genes that get to be passed on. Let's take a look at the niche the species lives in. This is essentially not only where the organism lives, but how does the organism utilize the area that they're living in? Do they come out to eat at night? Do they eat insects that are underneath the tree? Do they eat leaves that are up at the top of the tree? How do they live there? When do they live there? What are they? Generally with niches, they can't be occupied by two different species at the same time. If they do, that causes competition. When looking at niches, we do need to keep in mind the range of tolerance of that species. So how far does that niche extend? What is the range of abiotic factors that species can tolerate? What's the temperature range? What's the pH range? What's the humidity range that species can tolerate before it can't survive any longer? When looking at range of tolerance, we can look at the fundamental niche. This is essentially the textbook definition of where that species could potentially live. Just because it is textbook does not necessarily mean the species actually lives there. So that's the fundamental niche. The realized niche is where we're actually going to be finding that organism. So then we can look at the distribution of that species and where is that species distributed through that fundamental niche. And that is where the realized niche comes into play. We have two main types of species. We have a species generalist. They can live anywhere. They have a very large range of tolerance, meaning you can pick them up from where they're living currently, bring them to an entirely new place, and for the most part, they're going to survive and reproduce. Then we have specialist species. Specialist species have a very small range of tolerance. So it's very difficult for specialist species to pick up and move and be able to withstand changes in their environment. When looking at specialist species, these are the species that are generally going to go threatened and extinct before a generalist species, because a generalist can withstand bigger changes within their environment, where specialist species are much less tolerant of changes. Let's take a look at how islands impact biodiversity. This is called island biogeography. Island biogeography looks at ecological relationships and community structure on an island. And this could be a physical island or it can be a human-created island. So a physical island is what you're thinking, an island off the coast of a mainland. A human-created island could be something like parks within cities. Here's a picture of what's called the Emerald Necklace in Boston. It's a ring of parks throughout the city. So there's going to be species living in those little park areas, but they're essentially an island because they're surrounded by city. Central Park in New York is another example of this. There's a very large habitat of in the middle of the city. It's basically an island outside of the being connected to nature because it's surrounded by city. So when we're looking at island biogeography, a couple of little rules come into play. A larger island is generally going to have higher ecosystem diversity. It's going to have more niches available for organisms to take part. And there's going to be a greater number of species. And that's just because there's more space on this island. Larger islands are also more resistant to change, and they have a lower extinction rate because they have larger genetic diversity. Islands closer to the mainland, so if this is our mainland here, and we have islands, the closer the island, the greater number of species, and the greater the species richness. Because it doesn't take as long to get to this island as it gets to this island. So it's easier to colonize the closer island. So this one's going to have more variety than this one out here because it's further away from the mainland. So there is a positive relationship between the island size and the number of species or species richness. So as the island size gets bigger, the number of species goes up. So this is what our graph would look like, looking at island biogeography and the number of species or species richness versus island size. And if we're looking at distance of mainland to the number of species, it's going to be an inverse relationship. So the number of species is going to go down the further away from the mainland we're going to be. Because islands have limited resources and have very limited space, we often see what's called adaptive radiation in evolution occur. So adaptive radiation is essentially you have one common ancestor, basically one species that's going to give rise to a bunch of different species based on what's available for them to eat that allows them to survive and reproduce. So maybe on this island there are large nuts. So if we're looking at birds, a bird with a larger beak is going to survive and reproduce. So these birds will survive because they have a larger beak because they can eat the large nuts. Maybe on this one there's a lot of insects. So they have a more pointy beak. Maybe on this island they have small little seeds, and so they end up having a small little beak to eat. And so because the islands have limited resources available, those variations in traits are going to be the ones that allow them, the adaptations that allow them to survive and reproduce and keep on going. So those traits on this island, the trait of a larger beak is going to allow them to survive because they can eat the large nuts that are on that island. Where on this island, having a large beak isn't necessary. Those with the smaller beaks have an easier time eating the smaller seeds. So those are the traits that are passed on there. So adaptive radiation is essentially that one species giving rise to a bunch of different species, variations, different species based on what's available. And because of the limited resources, many islands have species specialists and not generalists because of the specific items that are available on that island. Let's look at a couple of things that causes biodiversity to decline. There is an acronym to help you remember this. It is HIPCO. H is habitat destruction or habitat fragmentation. This is generally going to be caused by humans, where we remove a habitat so we can put stuff for us, whether it be a house, a building, a road, a park. However we decide to change that ecosystem, it's going to be us either fragmenting, which is cutting up a habitat, or complete habitat destruction. I is invasive species. Invasive species are those species that are non-native, that are brought in by humans, and because they're generally species generalists, and because they don't really have any natural predators, natural diseases, they tend to take over and outcompete the organisms that are the native organisms that live there. We have two P's. One P is pollution. We have many different types of pollution that are going to affect biodiversity: air pollution, water pollution, thermal pollution, noise pollution. When we're talking about pollution, we need to make sure we're specific with the type of pollution that we're talking about. The other P is population. As the human population number rises, the more of all the rest of this we are going to be doing and putting impact onto biodiversity, the more area that we need to utilize and more resources that we are taking. So that is going to cause biodiversity to decline. C is climate change. With the average temperature rising of the planet, this is going to be changing the areas that organisms are able to live, or changing the range of where organisms can live. So maybe they are coming more south or going more north because of the temperature changes. Also, with the changes in pH in the ocean, that could also throw off the range of tolerance for some of these organisms. And lastly, we have O, which is overharvesting or overfishing. So this is essentially taking too many. When we go hunting or fishing, taking too many of the population falls below the threshold that they are able to keep up and keep their population going, because we have taken too many of those organisms out of the population. Biodiversity of an ecosystem keeps that ecosystem resilient and resistant. So the more biodiverse, the more resilient the ecosystem is. So when you're looking at the biodiversity declining or less resilience of an ecosystem, these are the things that you should think about to describe why biodiversity is declining. So that is the introduction to biodiversity. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.